So for folks that don't know, if you think your day job is tough, Admiral Rogers probably has you trumped with dual duties. Both the chief of the NSA and the U.S. Cyber Command, being a dual hat, started that in March 2014. Obviously, as you can tell from the many accolades on the uniform, a tremendous and storied career. Started as a flag, or most recently was a flag officer in 2007. Has also served as the Director for Intelligence for both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the U.S. Pacific Command, and most recently as Commander of the U.S. Fleet Cyber Command and the U.S. 10th Fleet before taking his current responsibilities. Speaking of education, aside from being a graduate of the Naval War College and the National War College, also an MIT Fellow and Harvard Senior Executive in National Security alumnus. So tremendous accolades. Please join me in welcoming.
You spend a lot of money as a taxpayer on
a lot of money as a taxpayer. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Mike Rogers. And not to be outdone, Congressman Mike Rogers, former Congressman Mike Rogers, in addition to being a former member of the U.S. House, also served as an officer in the Army and was an FBI special agent for 6 years. So has been I think, doing a number of things to help us. Obviously, most folks know him from being the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee for many years, leading, helping and oversee the overall $70 billion budget across the 17 different intelligence agencies. For folks that haven't followed what Mike has been doing since he left public service, you need to tune into CNN's Declassified, which is actually a great show that's been airing this summer. Rumor has it, it might have been successful enough to be picked up for a second year, so we can all look forward, I think, to seeing the next season. For folks that weren't watching, I think that actually starts to air in late spring and then kind of runs through summer, right, on Declassified. Now, that's not all he's doing, of course. He's actually staying engaged in quite a number of different areas, and those range from a commentating role that he's got on Something to Think About on Westwood One, and he's on the board of a number of cybersecurity companies, IronNet and MITRE, and is also advising Next Century Corporation and Trident Capital as well. So please join me in welcoming the other Mike Rogers.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, let's throw more Mike Rogers in there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can't have enough Mike Rogers in national security.
You can't. You really can't. I mean, this is a privilege for me because normally any meeting is a 2 Brian minimum. So, the fact that there's only 1 Brian and 2 Mike Rogers, it's a win. Now, we talked about a number of things that we could talk about, and I think we have a number of areas we can take this one. But to start out with on the policy side, policy is a really tricky one because the pace of the legislature and the pace of cybersecurity have never met, right? They're off by a number of orders of magnitude. And that means that it's really hard to regulate compliance. You really have to kind of try to drive incentives with policy. So is there anything that we've learned from the process of the CISA and CISPA regulations and trying to get those and work those through the system that we should apply to what we're doing in a forward-facing kind of policy? And maybe, Mike, you could kick us off.
Well, yeah, obviously. So there were a lot of things that we looked at when we were trying to do the first cyber sharing bill. I mean, how do we make it as short as possible? I think the first bill was 18 pages, right, which is nearly impossible to do in Congress. So we put an amendment in there of 400 pages just to make it look, serious. And here's what we found. We really need to define what we want our government to do. We have lots of capability. The NSA has lots of capability. We have not yet quite fully engaged in the public side of what we want our government to do. How engaged do you want the NSA in defending private sector networks across the United States? Haven't gotten there. So the sharing bill was just a really simple first step, and now the follow-on CISPA bill is a first step, and it gave us the opportunity to do liability protection, which allows this sharing, a more robust sharing environment of threats. And so if you want to be more forward-facing, we're going to have to look at all of the elements of what happens next. Did we put it in the right place? Is the DHS the agency that should be forward-leaning on cyber in the United States given the level of threats? We could probably debate that for an hour and a half. What incentives can we build in that allows the government to participate but the private sector to do its role? Attribution of nation-state attacks, some at least actuarial understanding of what cyber insurance needs to look like going forward. These are all things that the government can have a flavor in, but it really is going to, at the end of the day, have to be private sector led in what is forward-facing. Outside, as I said, what do you want your government to do and what role do you want them to play on your networks? That's a question we haven't answered.
Absolutely. And Admiral Rogers, anything you would add to that?
So I would agree. So what we've done is created a starting point, a framework that enables the movement of information back and forth. That's good, but that's not enough. So what we got to do now, I think, is figure out how do we generate activity that correlates to value. I'm not, it goes to your point about how you share information. Look, just throwing data out there for the sake of saying, look at the volume of things we're moving between you. That doesn't get to value. I think this also gives us the opportunity to step back and say, so what has worked well, what does not work well, and how does the private sector define value? Because I'm constantly reminding my government teammates, we should be providing insight and information that correlates to what generates positive outcomes for them, not the other way around. The primary focus should be on how do we harness the capability of the government to provide insight that supports the private sector in a way that is of value to the private sector, and not, hey, we're from the government, it's one size fits all, this is the way it is. That's not going to get us where we need to go.
You know, and that actually touches on one of the questions that we were going to hit later, but I think it makes sense to bring it up because this is a big pet peeve for me, right? Whenever I'm talking to organizations around the world, I tend to start with the senior information security teams, and I will ask them, what are you tracking, right? What is your outcome? What is success to you? And it amazes me that, you know, minimum 60% of the organizations I talk to say, I don't know, right? They don't actually track anything. And that kind of complicates this whole problem, right? Because from a defense effectiveness standpoint, it's really hard to understand. From a policy standpoint, it's really hard to understand. Are there things that you would suggest either as a fellow defender for organizations that they should be tracking success metrics? And back to our discussion on policy, is there anything that we should be driving that would actually help, you know, kind of deliver outcomes there as well? Because it's definitely an unsolved problem in cyber.
One of the things for us in the DoD is we're trying to, as, you know, so part of my job is Cyber Command is I'm responsible for defending the Department of Defense's network. So just like any CISO out there, I'm trying to ensure that our systems, our data, our platforms, and our capabilities are safe and are not being intruded upon, and our information is not being extracted or manipulated. One of the things that we've tried to identify is incentivize positive outcomes. And never forget the human dynamic on all this. People tend to respond well to colors, red, green, yellow. Hey, green is good, red is bad. Numbers, am I in the 90s? Am I in the 60s? How can you quantify what we're doing in ways, excuse me, I lost my,
That's right. It's a Russian-made.
damn it, Mike. So how do you quantify things in a way that people can relate to and that will drive behavioral change? So we have what we call the cyber scorecard. It's been an interesting evolution in the DoD. People don't like getting their homework graded. That's very normal. I get my homework graded as well. Interestingly, on that, I get my homework graded as NSA in that, so that's always an interesting evolution. But that has been very interesting so far, and that has tended to shape and drive much better outcomes because it translates cybersecurity into something that people who weren't necessarily deeply enmeshed in this can understand.
Yeah.
And two levels of this. So you get to the top Fortune 100 companies, they're all in. Mm-hmm. They understand the metrics they need to survive and brand protection and mitigation of problems. It starts getting hazy, even from the Fortune 100 down, Fortune 500 down, it gets really hazy. And so there's a disconnect sometimes between the board leadership and what you want your cyber defenders to do within your companies and the resources that they can apply. So I do think this is where I think setting these standards can be important. And I don't mean the government going out and saying, if you do these 5 things, you're going to be safe in the network. But there's been lots of talk about bringing folks together and say, okay, how can we do this private sector approach to providing some metrics on these companies so they at least know they're at least getting A, a good product, or B, getting it right. Things like, can you harmonize regulation across the government? Pretty confusing if you're in the Fortune 500, really confusing if you're a company out there somewhere that's a manufacturer that you know you're under siege. It's almost nearly impossible to navigate. So that's where the government can help. Can they set those kinds of standards? Can you harmonize regulation on cyber? Can you find at least some measure of, if we're going to reinforce the insurance market in cyber insurance, by the way, it's just not a mature market yet. Mm-hmm. And so you're wildly varied in the product you're going to get, in the caps that they place on that insurance. Does it really work? And a lot of companies are taking it, saying, I'm safe and I'm covered. I don't have to spend any more money on cyber. All of that's wrong. So you have to use those kind of mechanisms to instill at least a notion of a framework of what a metrics could look like in a company that doesn't have massive resources to pour into cyber. Good news is there's lots of great companies coming out with great new technology. This framework could kind of help that. And then you have companies like AT&T who are used to be worried about just getting information from point A to point B, have heavily invested in cybersecurity solutions, and they touch so much data, makes a lot of sense. So you're seeing this evolution in who is even those cybersecurity providers and where a company in the middle can get service that rates up there with the Fortune 100 companies. So you're seeing this change in the marketplace that I think is pretty exciting that will apply metrics based on free market principles. That cyber insurance is going to be a necessary evil here pretty soon, and that will help drive what those metrics are, and that can be a joint effort between the private sector and the government doing things like attribution and other things.
It'll at least kind of help the whole industry mature, right? Because right now there's been lots of good ideas. You know, I think the NIST critical standards for critical cybersecurity infrastructure, I always mess up that acronym, did a great job of converting security to English. But then if we can, you know, with things like cyber insurance, if we can put numbers behind it, I think it'll help everybody.
I think it will too.
Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier, Mike, was that there's a key kind of policy consideration is, have we put the responsibilities in the right areas, right? And you know, one thing that's kind of swirling around as a rumor is, you know, should we split cybercom from NSA? And, you know, let's talk about what's important.
Look at the time. Look at the time.
Oh, hey, what did he just say? But, you know, to the extent anyone can comment, and, you know, totally understand limits there, we'd love to hear both of your perspective on that one.
I tell you what, you go first, then I'll.
So lots of discussion. And let me just tell you how they got there. And I have candidly been going back and forth on this issue. So one of the reasons this started is that Cyber Command was using resources in the NSA for cybercom efforts. And candidly, you want that. We have soldiers in the field. We have folks in combat, in contact with the enemy. You want every single resource we can apply to make sure nothing bad happens, or we at least have a technological advantage on the battlefield. And Admiral Rogers has done that masterfully. And so the inside discussion of why they should be split is, do you want an organization that has the capability for what will likely be a more robust offensive capability and defense of military operations around the world, and a civilian intelligence agency that is signals-oriented? That's how that whole discussion got going. You know, and I heard the arguments even when I was chairman that it's muddling the resources. You're giving resources to a signals intelligence effort, and it slips over into combat operations. I don't believe that should be our problem. I don't think numbers in the box should be a reason we worry about this. But would that make both organizations more effective? The only thing I worry about is, now does Admiral Rogers have to talk to Director X at NSA to perform the same function he does today? If we can't eliminate that question, then I'm not sure I'd be for it.
So for us, I remind people, go back, Cyber Command, this structure is now slightly over 6 years old. The reason we started with this structure was, as we were building Cyber Command, we wanted to harness the effectiveness and efficiency that resulted in the significant investments the Department of Defense had already made in cyber, significantly at the National Security Agency, harness the insight capabilities and knowledge of NSA to assist Cyber Command as it was standing up, and also to try to be more faster, more effective, in the sense that you had one individual between these two organizations making choices, so that, quite frankly, you didn't have to raise these choices to the next higher level, the Secretary of Defense. The thought being, look, if you have to kick everything to the Secretary, you're not going to get speed. You're not going to get anything done in a timely way. It's 6 years later. We've got 6 years of runtime now. And so, as we often do, now we're stepping back and asking ourselves, so based on 6 years of experience, are the assumptions that we made still accurate? Have things changed? Is the environment different? Does that lead us to suggest that perhaps we need to do something differently? It's a sign of Cyber Command's maturation, I would argue, that we're even having this discussion now, which is a good thing for the nation, I would argue. My comment, my position has always been, look, I think it's the right thing to do in the long run. It's a reflection of the fact that Cyber Command, as it generates more capability, more capacity, as it's able to stand more and more on its own 2 feet. There are two slight differences in my role as an operation commander than as an intelligence leader. I'm the first to acknowledge that. I'm comfortable in my ability to straddle those two worlds, but I do acknowledge that they're different. The challenge in my mind is, what's the right time, what's the right process, so that we do it in a way that enables both organizations to fulfill their mission with minimal risk. And so we're working our way through that process. In the end, this is the decision that the President of the United States is going to make, and we'll see where that process takes us.
Makes a ton of sense. And I know we're running out on time, but I think we wouldn't be doing the audience justice if we didn't touch on threat intelligence sharing in particular. It's a big topic for both of you. It's a big topic for everyone here that's a defender. And there's a lot of work underway, in particular to use DHS as a clearinghouse for threat intelligence. And that's got kind of pros and cons. And it's, I think, a good step on a process that that is, as we talked about, even on the technology vendor side, we've tried a bunch of different things. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't. Again, what gives you kind of hope and confidence that the DHS as a clearinghouse for threat intelligence across the government is going to be effective? And any cautions or any concerns that the two of you would highlight that we need to work through as we try to implement that?
First on this one, since you helped.
Well, I might have a difference of opinion with you, which is why they put the flowers up here to block us. So one of the things that we did when we went through the original cyber sharing bill is we decided we were going to spend a lot of time, the committee, going out and interviewing companies and businesses who are in the business of trying to survive. Literally thousands of interviews. And candidly, and my DHS friends are not going to like to hear this, we did not get one example of someone saying, yes, I want to deal with DHS in this operation. And I don't mean that to degrade what they're doing. It just wasn't their specialty. It's not what they do. It wasn't what they had been doing, right? There's an agency that has 22 different agencies doing really 22 different missions. It's really a difficult place to get your arm around. So our biggest concern was, and candidly, a lot of the configuration was politically driven, not necessarily policy driven. People were a little nervous about having NSA even connected to the ability to help process and share information that ran through DHS, and they didn't want companies, even folks who had direct relationships with NSA or other agencies, even DOD, to directly go to them, because they thought it would diminish. I mean, their argument was pure, I think, but I think the outcome just hasn't been exactly what we want. If you ask businesses today, they don't know who to call. They don't know what they talk about if they got a hold of somebody. That's a huge problem. We've been in this for a few years now. That tells me we probably don't have this right just yet. And my argument, again, this is what do you want your government to do? My argument has always been, why did we take our best players off the field? Name another area of national security where your government doesn't protect you when it comes to a missile threat or a military invasion, fill in the blank, a domestic terrorism act. Well, what we've said is we're going to have every company in America is going to have to defend themselves against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, every international organized crime group that has ever devised a way to get into your networks. And good luck with that, because we don't really want the NSA kind of messing around with it. And I'm not saying we want the NSA to monitor our domestic networks. I think it's a bad idea. But there are ways we can do this to get their expertise a little ramped up at DHS to make it a fully functioning organization. We're just not there yet. And I think we would all be remiss if we don't take this as an opportunity to say, okay, what is working at DHS and what's not working? The threat level is getting worse. You have nation states have now decided to use cyber as a political tool. That we are entering a very dangerous time, I think, in regard to that. And the more a nation state gets away with it, the more other nation states are going to say, build 2 more carrier groups or hire another 100,000 trained cyber warriors. I think I know where I'm going. And so we've got to answer these questions. I think we have to answer them soon. And this is going to have to be a policy discussion. I think if you ask all of the agencies, they'll all have their own opinion. I'm eager to hear Mike Rogers. This is how we're going to know if he's retiring or not, what his answer is.
Well, based on my answer, I may be retiring.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. So, first of all, I agree with Mike. This is one we got to get right. And I would suggest that the environment we find ourselves in today and what we're likely to face in the coming years is very different in many ways than what was it's even worse than what was anticipated when we created some of the structures of today. We'll have a significant change upcoming in the form of a new administration in a couple months. I think that's a great opportunity for us to step back and assess what's worked, what has not worked. If you were building this from the ground up, how would you create it? Because we don't want to be the prisoners of necessary decisions we've made in the past. What I mean by that is, given the changes we're seeing in the environment, I think what we really need to do is step back and ask ourselves, what's the optimal way to do this? Not, hey, do I start from automatically from where I am and that's what I have to go with? I think really this is an opportunity for us to step back, say if you were building it from the ground up, what would you do? And what are the best attributes that you're looking for? Because doing more of the same is not likely to generate different outcomes. And clearly, whether you're in the private sector, I think when you're in the government, we would all acknowledge we are not where we want to be and we are not where we need to be. Perhaps most importantly, we're just not where we need to be. And so I'd like to see if we can take this as an opportunity to ask, well, how do we get to where we need to be?
It's a great opportunity to kind of use an election cycle to force a change event. And speaking of change events, I just want to conclude by thanking Mike and Mike, because I view both of them in their careers as being tremendous cybersecurity change agents. If you look at the impact they've had both as policymakers, as defenders, on their impact on the industry cannot be overstated. So Mike and Mike, thanks for joining everybody.
Brian.
Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Mike.